wages go up when there's so many people out of work.
The really important thing to keep in mind is we're starting a brand new economic cycle right now.
There is going to be a lot of investment. There is going to be a lot of spending and policy support.
Fiscal stimulus isn't there yet, and you've got a complete lack of coordination.
These central banks have locked themselves in to being stuck at their effective lower bounds.
It's not that we're not going to grow in 2021, is will it be enough?
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowitz.
From New York and London, for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Tom Keene is away today. He'll be back tomorrow. Lisa Abramowitz, we're almost there. It is the final full trading week of 2020.
Don't say that. It's going to jinx everything. Come on, we got to get to the end before we start talking about that. And there are deadlines to be talking about. What are the meaning of deadlines? We get to talk about Brexit again. John, your favorite topics?
50 seconds into the show, you want to bring up the B word.
Well, I was reading about
2 hours.
I was reading about deadlines, and I was thinking about your philosophical question, what is a deadline? And we kind of are back to that question yet again, not only with Brexit, but also with respect to fiscal support back in Washington. The more things stay the same, or rather, the more things change, the more things stay the same.
Yeah, I think we've got to deal with the reality of what's about to take place this week. There will be discussions about this relief plan that you're going to talk about in just a moment, but also the data, Lisa. Later this week, retail sales, initial jobless claims. I think really important to try and understand the direction, the trajectory this economy's on. Just as vaccinations begin in America, we're here. The vaccinations start. How much pain in between before we can roll this out in a big way?
Yeah, and you've talked about this really importantly, the idea of the here and now being a lot of pain, a lot of people just looking past it. Today, U.S. lawmakers are expected to unveil that $908 billion bipartisan relief plan. What I find interesting is you're going to end up seeing two parts. It's broken into a $748 billion plan and a $160 billion plan, trying to strip out some of the controversial areas that we keep talking about of state and financial aid versus the liability issues around COVID. Also today, to your point, John, about the split fates of the here and now versus the future of a vaccinated America and a vaccinated world, New York City is halting indoor dining in restaurants yet again to stave off the spread of the virus. Also today, the U.S. Electoral College meets to officially elect Joe Biden as next president. John, we're still talking about this. President Trump has lost several court cases. A lot of people are expecting this to sort of put a cap on this election season.
Still got to work out the composition of Congress, of course, the January 5th runoffs in Georgia, the next stop. What a first week of January we've got for you. When we kick things off, we've got the runoffs in Georgia, then we've got payrolls Friday shortly after that. I know we've got to get through 2020, but the first week of January, we hit the ground running and running hard. Here's the price action this Monday morning. Good morning to you all worldwide. Here's the equity market. On the S&P 500, 3681. Up 0.8%, up around about 28 points. This time last year, Lisa Abramowitz, what do you think the year ahead, year-end 2020 consensus was for the S&P 500 in the survey we do here at Bloomberg? What do you think the average S&P year-end forecast was?
3,400.
3,280.
Wow.
3,280 was the average call on Wall Street for where this market would finish. And we had a nice little sneak peek of 3,700 in the last week. Now, Lisa, if we told these analysts, these strategists on the sales side what would happen this time last year, looking out 12 months, I'm not sure they would have upgraded their forecast to 36, 37, 3,800 on the S&P.
No, if you talk about a global pandemic, the worst, steepest recession since the Great Depression, people wouldn't naturally say, wow, it must have been quite a rally on the S&P. I do want to say, though, that one thing that caught my eye over the weekend was Morgan Stanley predicting that central banks globally would put $2.8 trillion of additional bond purchases, additional liquidity into global markets over the next year, just to give you a sense of how much more we have and what's actually supporting this rally.
Mike Wilson and the team at Morgan Stanley, they're at 3,900 for anyone interested. 3,900 on the S&P year-end 2021. Peter Scher joins us now, Economy Securities Head of Macro Strategy. Peter, what a couple of weeks this has been. Are you leaning into this? Leaning into some of the euphoria that we can all feel?
Yeah, a little bit cautious. I think we have to make it through Tesla's inclusion. I think a lot of this Band-Aid stimulus has already been priced in. So I'm leaning into a little bit, and I still really expect a big rotation where the have-not stocks do well. Because next year I expect stimulus, but I expect, proper stimulus, where we really focus on job creation, where we're going to get a big bang for the buck, maybe involve an infrastructure bank, get public-private. So I view this current stimulus, it's nice, but it's nowhere near sufficient for what we need to get real economic growth.
Well, let's get the policy call right first, and then we can get to the market call. The policy call this year has just been the only call to get right, and then you've absolutely nailed the rest of it, lean into risk. The policy call, you called this an aid Band-Aid. Peter, it's $908 billion what's on offer today. Is that a Band-Aid these days?
Unfortunately, it is. As we're shutting down more and more businesses, I think we have to make sure those people receive some sort of compensation. So this is more just to keep things going, as I see it. And we're not seeing true economic spending where we're going to get real growth. We're not seeing enough spending towards rebuilding manufacturing, fixing some of our infrastructure, making sure we catch up and surpass other countries on 5G technology. So that's what I expect to happen next year. And that's where we'll get the real boost. This, for now, I think, is really just covering up the problems that are coming from this resurgence in COVID cases.
Covering up the problems, is that enough to justify the rally that we've seen on the heels of expected support financially from Washington, D.C., and potentially the end of the pandemic at some point next year?
Yeah, I think we're reasonably priced. I think the market's kind of figured out the pandemic. We have to make it through this struggle right now. But ultimately, with vaccines and treatments and everything improving, we will get through. And some point next year, the economy should look very good. And that's why, again, even today, you're starting to see some of the small caps, value stocks continue to outperform big tech as this belief sinks in that, hey, we will have something that resembles a normal economy. It won't be work from home necessarily. It won't be going back to the office. But there's a lot going on. There's a lot of reason for optimism. There'll be ongoing central bank support. I think the Treasury Department will work well with the Fed. So I don't think we're mispriced. I just think we're due for a little pullback, especially surrounding this Tesla inclusion in the S&P 500, which occurs at the close Friday.
Okay, so we'll get to Tesla perhaps, but I'm wondering about Airbnb and DoorDash and some of these other IPOs that are coming out with valuations that are reminiscent of the tech bubble. I mean, the idea that they doubled in price, does it give you a feeling of froth, or is this also reasonably valued?
I think that's typical for these sorts of very hot IPOs where you don't necessarily want to squeeze every last cent out. You're only releasing a small number of shares. So it sounds like the company maybe left money on the table, but the bulk of their shares are still kind of held in reserve that they can issue going forward. So I'm not worried about that. I think there's been a lot of, hyperactive trading. We do see a lot of these small accounts participating. Whether these prices all last or not, it's a little bit, up in the air. Again, I think this is really going to depend on what we get in terms of policy next year. And partly what we haven't talked about is the negative potential for policy. Do we see tax increases again, especially at the corporate level? And then some of these valuations might look a little bit more frothy.
Peter, do you think that comes on the table, that conversation, at some point in 21?
We've been looking at this market as we think Congress and the Senate and the president are going to try and address everyone's been talking about this K-shaped recovery, that downward slope of the K. I think that gets addressed, right? And that's all good. That's the positive. That's the stimulus. The question is that upward slope of the K. Do they do something to punish that? Do they say, hey, you've been really successful, so we want to take something away from you? Or do they let that slide? I think for the economy, it's probably indifferent. For markets, it's much better if they let it slide. I think a lot will hinge on that Georgia election.
January 5th, Peter, for you, is that when you start to establish what your year outlook really looks like after that event?
Yeah, I think right now we've got a base case of we're going to get some decent amount of stimulus because I think the Republicans are on board. They kind of failed to get any sort of stimulus done, which, of all the things I would have expected President Trump to be good at, it was building things. We did not get any infrastructure done. So I think some level that's going to be done regardless of the outcome. I think the outcome is going to switch how much. So if the Democrats win, we'll see more spending. I also expect it to switch the mix. So we'll see a much bigger environmental and sustainability focus if the Democrats win the Senate. I think less so if the Republicans retain the Senate.
So given all this fiscal support that you're expecting and fiscal stimulus, actual stimulus next year, Treasury yields, are we going to see them above 1%? How high can they possibly get?
I think we get them above 1% fairly quickly. I'm kind of in the near term, call it the next few weeks, thinking we're between 1 and 1.25. I think it's hard to get much above even 150. I think the Federal Reserve will work very closely with the Treasury Department to control any rise. And again, markets, I think, will be fine if we see a rising Treasury yield, so just as long as it's not a rapidly rising Treasury yield. Though again, to me, that would really help these small economies, those cyclicals, and probably less helpful for some of the big, large tech valves.
Yellen and Powell working hand in hand. Peter Chair, great to catch up, sir. Peter Chair of Academy Securities. Peter, thanks for everything this year as well. Have a fantastic Christmas if we don't talk again. Peter Chair there of Academy Securities on this market. Lisa Abramowitz, Wednesday, the Fed. You asked the question about yields going through 1%. Do they give it the green light?
Yeah.
Or do they suggest they'll be ready to step back in?
Well, a survey of economists has talked about how they expect them to tie their increase in longer dated bond purchases to financial conditions more intimately, but not start to extend the duration of their purchases. But everyone is expecting them to increase the length of the bond maturities. Again, you have to wonder, John, what they're hoping to achieve at a point when you don't necessarily see financial conditions exactly tight.
So I think there's a big difference between hoping to achieve something and hoping to prevent something.
Good call.
And I think at this point for the ECB and the Federal Reserve, they're hoping to prevent worse things from happening. And I think they recognize that the additional dollar or euro of QE isn't going to achieve much at all. It's the fight with the counterfactual, Lisa. What happens if they step away? And I think we both know what happens if they step away at this point, given where these markets are trading.
Well, and that's the question. If they don't signal some sort of change to their bond purchase program, what does that do? I mean, do you get a taper tantrum, what Priya Misra was talking about, or do people shrug it off? That's, to me, the big unknown.
We do not want that into year end. Brian Weinstein might. Morgan Stanley head of global fixed income. I'm pretty sure Brian Weinstein's not calling for it.
Yeah, I was about
He'll be joining us a little bit later this hour on Bloomberg. Alongside Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Tom Keane out of the building. He's taken a nice little day off, a long weekend. He'll be back tomorrow. Futures are positive, up 28 on the S&P 500. We advanced 0.75% to kick off the final full trading week of 2020. For our audience worldwide on radio and TV, this is Bloomberg.